Good evening and welcome to Voice of BC. I'm Vaughn Palmer, and it's a busy time in British Columbia, and a very busy man has agreed to share an hour on this show. The most frequent guest on the show in the long history of Voice of BC, John Horgan, now Premier of British Columbia. Welcome back. Thank you.
Thanks, Vaughn. Good to be here as always.
So you took up a fair amount of time this morning, today, Thursday, if you're watching us live, to announce, I think, a big deal, a step forward in the direction of LNG. You said that it was both a great opportunity and a great risk. Explain to people what you mean by that.
Well, anytime we talk about massive public or private investments, we want to make sure that government's paying attention. And the LNG project in Kitimat, LNG Canada, has proposed to invest some $40 billion in British Columbia over the next number of years to bring on an ability to export our abundant natural resources when it comes to natural gas. So we took a look at their project. We involved the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Energy to make sure that we got the numbers right on their investment and what the consequences would be for our climate action goals. And the risk I talked about this morning was that the foundation of my government is ensuring that we're putting in place the foundation of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples in BC, first and foremost. Secondly, we want to make sure that we have realistic and achievable climate action goals. We campaigned on reducing our greenhouse gas emissions by 40% in the next 12 years by 2030. That's an ambitious goal, and it will have an impact on all of our lives, and we need to all work together to achieve that. So that's on the risk side. The benefit side is $40 billion of private sector money, which will, over the long term, result in taxation for those who are working in the industry, taxation on the company who will be making the investments, and royalties from extracting the resource, which will, we project over 40 years, be some $22 billion. Healthcare, education, transportation initiatives, and reducing emissions over the whole economy. That's a real benefit and an opportunity. So we have to weigh as a government, what are the risks, what are the benefits? And today I wanted to outline for the public through the media and our press conference that, we're going to take this on, but ultimately the decision rests with the joint venture partners. If they believe that this is a solid investment for their shareholders, they'll make it. And I wanted to be absolutely clear well in advance. This won't happen for months now. It's not happening tomorrow or the next day. Maybe they'll make a decision in October or November. The investment would happen perhaps in 2019. But I wanted to make sure the public understood that for me, this is a significant opportunity, but I'm not oblivious to the risks, and I think that's what they expect of their government.
90 minutes after you spoke to the news media on this, we had Andrew Weaver, the Green leader, had a press conference in the legislative foyer, flanked by his two fellow Greens. It ran about 30 minutes, and if anyone out there can find the entire thing, you might want to watch it, because it was difficult at times to figure out exactly what Weaver was threatening, promising, saying. But the one thing that came through was he does not believe that this is compatible with the government's climate targets. And he said unless that changes, and he doesn't think it will change, he and the Greens have lost confidence in your government. He was asked repeatedly, different scenarios, would he vote against the government in this? And he didn't say. So. Yeah. What's your understanding? You have the power sharing agreement with him. What's your understanding of what he's doing and saying?
Well, Andrew and I meet regularly, and we talk about the initiatives that the government is working on. We talk about our confidence agreement that the two caucuses, the NDP and the Green caucus, agreed to allow us to form the government last year. And I believe it's working very well. Now, there are those that, and I don't mean this in a negative way, that oftentimes people want to make mischief of the fact that we often disagree on component parts of policy. That is what happens when you have people of strong opinions working together. And I absolutely respect Andrew's understanding and passion and commitment to climate action. That's why he got involved in politics. He's unapologetic about that. To his credit, when I raised the issue of this potential investment with him some weeks ago, he was extremely skeptical and didn't believe that we could make this work. But he also understands that we have a lot of work to do between now and the fall when, if maybe, Shell decides to make this investment. So we wanted to put down a marker today, and I'm confident the Green Group and Andrew wanted to as well, saying we don't believe you can do this, but we're going to give you the benefit of the doubt. Show us how this fits into an aggressive climate action plan, and that's what we're going to undertake in the months ahead. But that the public and those watching at home need to understand, we need to drive down our emissions. Whether LNG comes or not, we have a significant challenge ahead of us on the industry side, on transportation, and in our own homes and our buildings. We need to reduce our emissions to meet our national objectives. And I know British Columbians are passionate about this, but no one, I would say, without alienating any of my colleagues, no one is more passionate about this in the legislature than Andrew Weaver. And so he has made that abundantly clear to me. But we have a whole bunch of issues we're working on together, innovation in the economy, making sure that we're addressing wild salmon issues. The list is long of things that we agree on. So we're focusing on those. And on this issue about can we fit an increase in emissions into a plan that's designed to reduce them. That means everyone else has to tug a little bit harder to make space for this investment in the north. And Mr. Weaver's giving us the space to prove it, and I'm hopeful we can.
The other instant reaction today to this announcement, and obviously there's much more to come on understanding it, was from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, which Seth Klein put out a tweet on social media saying that he'd been very, very critical of the giveaways, what he regarded them as, to the LNG industry under the Liberals. And he said in a first reading of the relief that the New Democrats are offering here to the LNG industry, it is a worse deal. He says you're giving away more than the Liberals did.
Well, I disagree respectfully with Seth's opinion on that. What we announced today was that we are going to apply the same industrial rate for electricity to LNG that we would to a mining company, a forestry company, an advanced manufacturing company. There are 3 tariffs that BC Hydro provides to customers. There's the residential rate that you and I and your viewers pay. There's a commercial rate for dry cleaners and others. If you go to the mall, the people there pay a commercial rate for their electricity, and then there's the industrial rate. What the Liberals did was they created a 4th level of tariff on LNG, and we said, well, let's do away with that. That's unnecessary. It's cumbersome for government to administer. They're an industry, just like any other. They should pay the industrial rate. So that's the first component. The second piece was on relief for provincial sales tax on the development of the plant. Many industries get relief if they're building a manufacturing facility in British Columbia already. That's happened for a number of years. What we proposed is that we would give relief to LNG Canada for the period of construction, but they would be obliged to pay us the property or the provincial sales tax over the lifetime of the plant. So we're allowing them to build the facility, get a stream of revenue, and then pay the tax once that starts. So it's not a giveaway at all. They would still be required to pay the tax. And the third element is what we call energy-intensive trade-exposed industries. The cement industry, the mining industry, some advanced manufacturing requires a carbon intensity that we are trying to reduce. And we give them a concession, a break on their carbon pricing so that they are not adversely affected in the marketplace because they have to compete with jurisdictions that have no carbon pricing. And that's what we're proposing in this case. So I disagree with Seth, and none of these initiatives will come into place unless the company agrees to a final investment decision. We're not going to pass any bills. We're not going to provide any concessions until such time as they make the investment decision. And I think that's reasonable. And I think most British Columbians would agree with that.
In terms of an opportunity, and we'll get on to other topics, for the Greens to bring down the government or defeat it on a confidence matter, we're still learning the ways of the legislature in British Columbia, although last year was a pretty instructive year for that. But as I understand it, a piece of legislation comes in that would change a tax bill, say, on LNG. The Greens could vote against it. The Liberals could vote for it. They generally support LNG. That wouldn't bring down the government. The only real bring down the government vote is called a confidence vote, and it's essentially the budget and supply of finances, which wouldn't be coming up till next year sometime.
That's right. And again, there won't be any investment until next year. So this is, and I appreciate that there will be those that want to stir the pot between Andrew and I.
Surely you wouldn't suggest the news media would.
No, I wasn't being specific. I was being general.
You're not critical of the media the way you used to
never,
be. Never.
Not for months now. But no, it's and this is again, I give full credit to Andrew that he's not stepping back one iota from his principles and his values on this question, but he's giving the government the space to try and make it work. And if it doesn't, we'll hear about it in spades. I'm confident of that, not just from him, but from Seth Klein and others. I would suggest to those who are instantly critical today, they take a look at what the previous government would have done in this situation. And I joked about it today, that the previous government would have had marching bands and balloons would drop from the sky. You know, this is going to change the world. The streets are going to be paved with gold. Everyone's getting tax breaks. We just said, this is the government doing the business of the people. Someone approached us and said, we'd like to invest some money in your community. What is the fiscal framework which we would operate under? And we said, well, there's not just a fiscal framework. We have a reconciliation agenda with Indigenous peoples that you need to be mindful of. And in the case of LNG Canada, they're working very effectively with most of, not all, but most of the Indigenous communities from the wellhead to the waterline, particularly the Haisla Nation in Kitimat, which is absolutely enthusiastic about this. The communities along the corridor, Kitimat, Smithers, all the way to Port St. John, also, by and large, positive about the impact an investment like this would make. And lastly, we need to make sure we're meeting our climate objectives. So those are the terms of reference, the terms of engagement for investment in this type of a project. And I think it's absolutely reasonable to tell the public the same thing we told the investor. These are the rules. We wish you well. And to Mr. Weaver, he said, okay, I'm skeptical, but we'll see how it goes. And I think that's a reasonable, mature way for all of us to proceed.
And people who've seen previous John Horgan appearances on this show, of which there are many, will know that he has generally been supportive of LNG over the years. And I'm here to tell you, because I covered the press conference, he was not wearing a hard hat today. And so far, there are no slogans painted on the side of his campaign bus, so we shall see. We have a lot of questions for you tonight, and we've got some starter questions from those two noted authors, Richard Zussman and Rob Shaw, whose A Matter of Confidence will be the subject of next week's show, their account of what happened last year. So I thought we start off with a few questions from them, and here's one from Richard.
Premier, no doubt becoming Premier is a challenge, a little bit different than what life used to be like. What's a thing that you've had the hardest time getting used to?
You know, Vaughn, I get that question all the time from my neighbors, from my family, from people just walking down the street. I was on the sea bus yesterday going from Vancouver to the North Shore to have a series of meetings with people, and I'm hanging out on the sea bus, and people were coming up saying, what are you doing here? Aren't you supposed to be in a helicopter or, you know, a submarine when you cross the Burrard Inlet? And so I was worried that I would not be able to engage with people, which is, as an Irishman and as someone who just genuinely likes people, I was worried that there would be a barrier between me and my neighbors. And so far, so good on that front. My wife and I are struggling with our date nights. For example, was the Governor General's visit this week to Victoria. We were able to go to to Government House together. We arrived together and we left together, but the time between those 2 points we were apart. So that's been a challenge for her. Our children are grown and out of the house, and we had plans as a couple of how we would spend this time in our lives, and it's not quite working out that way. So I think the biggest adjustment is, how do we continue to enjoy each other and enjoy this this great opportunity to be the leader of a government at a time when people are excited about the prospects for positive change, and being on the sea bus, walking down the street in any town I'm in. There are some boo birds, but not very many, and I don't know how long that will last, Vaughn. I'm just going to take it while it comes. Been in politics
to know long enough, I think, to know that it won't last.
It won't last forever. So I'm going to enjoy it while it does.
I liked your wife's line, Ellie's line to the local newspaper, that she can't send you out for milk anymore because it takes you 4 hours to get home.
Yeah. Well, in fact, someone when we were leaving Government House said, "Don't forget the milk," as I was leaving. So, yeah, no, that's been the biggest challenge. But what a great opportunity, and I'm relishing every minute. Only once in the past 8 months have I rolled over in bed and said I don't want to get up, and that's unusual. You know, I mean, to be able to bounce out of bed in the morning saying, what's new, what are we going to do today to make life better for people? What a great opportunity, and I'm enjoying every minute of it.
Rob Shaw doing the bad cop to go with Sussman's good cop. Here he is.
Premier, your government's spending money already advertising its provincial budget. And I know in opposition, you took a lot of exception to the money that the Liberals spent on advertising, saying it was a waste of money, and that they shouldn't have been using it for their purposes. Can you tell us why your government is spending advertising money the same way? And what happened to the plan to get the Auditor General to vet all government ads to make sure they weren't partisan? Is that still something you're doing? And how will that fit into all the money that you're spending?
Well, thank you, Rob. First of all, the money that we've been spending since the budget largely is to inform people of the challenges that we uncovered at ICBC. If you look at the ad buy, much of it is about product reform and how we're going to try and square the circle of the lack of resources at ICBC to meet the needs of policyholders. So that was a significant chunk of the investment in advertising around the budget. Other elements were about talking about a 30-point plan on housing and what the impact was going to be on people. Now, we have been consulting Carol James since the tabling of the budget on what will the impacts be on the speculation tax, on the foreign buyers tax, on the demand side, and also how can we make sure that we're bringing on more supply. We need to build more houses. Everyone agrees on that point. And so we want to make sure that people understand that we're open for business. We want to hear from them. And I'm unapologetic about that. But Rob's right. We made commitments to ensure that we weren't doing ads, patting ourselves on the back. And I don't ever want to find myself being the head of a government that's spending money saying, look how good we are, because that's not the intention of this ad campaign. It's to inform people about the challenges that we're facing and then trying to implement the policies to make life better for people.
We've had, all of us in the media, a flood of notes and letters and complaints from people on the speculation tax in particular, focusing on one leading issue, which is British Columbians who pay their taxes in BC with vacation properties in BC, looking at what the Finance Ministry website says, which it says they'll pay the tax, the speculation tax, and they may get some of it back on their income taxes. Now, I heard you again yesterday saying that the government recognizes there were unintended consequences of this and it'll be changed, and yet the Finance Ministry continues to say on their website, I checked this morning, you will pay this tax if you have a vacation property in BC. What's unintended about that? How do you square that? Why don't you at least get them to stop saying that?
Well, good point. But if we took it down, the question would have been the website's been changed. What are you going to replace it with? Yeah. So Carol will be. She's working very hard on this, and it's been.
But you're going to undo this, is what I hear you saying.
We're going to do our level best to make sure the objectives of the tax, which were to get speculation out of the marketplace, are realized. There was no intention at any time that I was aware of, and I think Carol would agree, to penalize people who have the good fortune of having a cottage on Main Island or on the beach.
Some of them must be in your riding.
Some of them,
right?
well, yeah,
You've
absolutely.
probably heard from them.
Well, I have, and I've tried to assure them that wasn't the intention. And I think it's important to go back to the intention, Vaughn, because in all of your time covering politics in British Columbia, just on the show, much less all of the other work you've done in media and print and other programs, I have never seen an issue sustain the level of public awareness that housing has over the past 24 months. Top of the polls, every time someone's asked, what's the number one issue? Over 50% of people are saying housing, housing, housing. We talked about offline about our announcement yesterday about knee and hip replacement surgeries to try and get that backlog down to a reasonable level. And the orthopedic surgeon said this is a great idea, but we need to attract doctors to come here and it costs too much to live here. So if we can't attract orthopedic surgeons to Vancouver and to Victoria, how are we going to attract all of the other healthcare providers that make the system work, or other professionals, or just regular people to come and live and work in this spectacular province? Housing's the number one issue. That's what our starting point was, and there have been unintended consequences, and I have every confidence that Carol James has heard that loudly and clearly from all corners of British Columbia, and she'll be addressing that in the weeks ahead, days ahead.
Take a brief break on Voice of BC with Premier John Horgan. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
One of the fundamental shifts we have noticed over the past year is the greater access we have to government decision makers at the minister level, as well as at deputy minister and assistant deputy minister level. And it's been really refreshing, including Premier Horgan making himself available to mayors and chairs in the regional districts so we can have direct dialogue with government. Under the previous regime, I think being in power for so long, there was an inbred arrogance that they knew what they were doing, they knew what we needed, and that we didn't need to advise them or convince them of anything. So that's been very refreshing, and we really appreciate that access.
I'm Mike Farnworth, the Solicitor General for British Columbia, sometimes known as the province's top cop. And I'm here to let you know that it's a crime not to watch Voice of BC.
Are you worried about getting diabetes?
I'm a millennial.
Well, sorry, but 1 in 3 Canadians has diabetes or prediabetes.
Really?
The Canadian Diabetes Association, with support from Sun Life Financial, urges all Canadians to take the test.
There are more ways to connect with us at Voice of BC. Email us at vobc@shaw.ca. Follow us on Twitter at Voice of BC. Or like us on Facebook at facebook.com/VOBC on Shaw TV. A notable line from the throne speech was that it was up to government to transform people's lives. And that's a philosophical approach. So I think you're seeing an attempt by the NDP to make sure that the three factions within their party are kept happy. And I think they are going to attach themselves rigidly to the opposition to Kinder Morgan because they need to in order to maintain their bona fides for their activist friends.
Welcome back to Voice of BC, and we have a brand new leader of the opposition and the Liberal Party in the legislature. And here from Richard Zussman, a question about that. Here he is.
Premier, you've now gone up against the new Liberal leader, Andrew Wilkinson, for about a month. He says one of his big goals was to get under your skin. Has he gotten under your skin yet?
No, he hasn't got under my skin yet. In fact, I'm, again, as an observer of the legislature, I'm in question period almost every day, but I'm not getting questions every day. And when I was in opposition, whether it was under the leadership of Gordon Campbell or Christy Clark, the Premier showed up once a week, maybe twice a week, to take questions. And I'm surprised that they haven't asked me more questions about where we're going, but they've also been testing ministers, and I'm very proud of the work that my colleagues have done to be on top of their files in a short period of time and show leadership on a number of issues that matter to people. So Mr. Wilkinson is a very accomplished individual. He's very intelligent, and he's a little bit older than me. So, I say that because, Vaughn, you'll remember that I was looking for
younger than me.
I was looking for a new generation of leadership in BC. As it turns out, now I'm the young guy. So, but no, he's very capable. I don't underestimate him for a second, and he has a role to play. Interesting, the piece with Mary Polak just before Richard's question was about factions within political parties. And one of the reasons, and I'm fairly confident we'll have a question on proportional representation, but what proportional representation does is it takes the factions that parties become and put them on the ballot before the election. And then the coalitions of opinion and view and perspective have to come together after the election in the interest of everybody. And I think that certainly there are groups within the NDP, there are groups within the Liberal Party, there are groups within the Green Caucus, I'm sure, as well. So that's just part and parcel of the diversity of opinion in British Columbia and in Canada, and I think that's, at the end of the day, a really good thing.
One more from Mr. Shaw before we move on to other questioners. Here he is.
Premier, do you think you've accomplished anything in resetting the tone of the legislature? I know you've spoken in the past about wanting to pass more private members' bills, get a functioning question period, get parliamentary committees going where everyone could debate. I don't think that's happened in the first couple sessions of your government. Why not? And what do you think you can do to make that happen, if at all?
Well, I disagree with the premise of the question. We've done a great deal on the parliamentary reform side. We have committees that don't have an absolute majority of government members because of the unique configuration of the House. There are Green members who may well support the government on various issues, but there is every opportunity for the diverse makeup of the legislature to be reflected in committees. We've established a couple of special committees, the one on ride hailing or the so-called Uber, bringing in ride sharing into British Columbia. Again, that was a suggestion from the opposition. We said, good idea, let's do that. I want to share power with British Columbians, not hold it close to my chest. And I think that's a distinctive difference between my approach to this job and others that have had it in the past. And that, of course, is, as Rob suggests, is a measure of what I find myself dealing with, a minority parliament. So you're obliged to be more consensus-oriented. But I think it's better for policy outcomes, and it's better for British Columbians to know that we will not have rigid lines that can't be crossed because of partisan politics. I think people want us to figure out, how do you make my life better? And I don't want you squabbling, I want you working together, whether you're Liberal, Conservative, Green, New Democrat. And it's my objective to make sure that happens. We've had a very, very ambitious budget, and now the debate of the estimates of the various ministries is happening. You'll remember when the fixed calendar was put together back in the turn of the century, the spring was for the budget and the fall was for legislation. So we are going to have a series of bills coming forward, legislation, in the next week or two as the House gets back. But the focus will be in the fall, where we'll bring in the legislation that will shape the next budget coming in February. And I think that was what the government of Gordon Campbell had in mind when they brought in the fixed calendar. We haven't lived to that in my time here, and I want to make sure that we do.
Bill Tillman, good question.
Premier Horgan, it seems like you and your government have inherited an awful lot of landmines or Pandora's boxes from the previous BC Liberal administration. I see BC as the so-called dumpster fire. We've seen huge problems in lotteries, we've seen money laundering going on, and we've got an incredible housing crisis. Of all the things you've had to deal with, which one keeps you up at night the most?
Wow, Bill's got a good inventory there of the challenges that we inherited when we arrived. The one that, the ICBC one was a surprise, although you wrote a column about us highlighting that when there was a difference in annual reports before the last budget. So we were aware of it, but there was no pickup. We focused on other issues. We went into an election campaign, and after the campaign discovered that, man, we were, not only were we right in our line of questioning in opposition, but the problem was far graver than we had anticipated. But Bill touched on the money laundering piece, and that's one that David Eby, our Attorney General, has been working on very closely with a consultant that we hired to look into this. And that is a black mark on our province, it's a black mark on our country, and it's had an adverse impact on policy making because of the money that's generated through the Lottery Corporation and others that will be emerging in the days ahead. And that then translates into the housing crisis. So we've had people laundering money here in British Columbia to then move it into the real estate sector. I think Sam Cooper and your paper has been doing a spectacular job of uncovering these stories. And Minister Eby's off to Ottawa to speak to a federal committee on the question either this week or next week. And I think that's the one that caught me most by surprise. What keeps me up at night is worrying about people. And why do we want to eliminate medical services premiums? Because it'll put money in people's pockets. Why do we get rid of tolls? Because it makes life more affordable for them. Those are the things that I care about. The policy issues are interesting, and you know I'm a bit of a geek when it comes to policy stuff. But what really worries me is how are people doing? And people are struggling out there. It is really tough to live in British Columbia. It's unaffordable in many parts of the province, and wages aren't keeping pace with the cost of living. So those are the things that I really concern myself with.
I was shocked to discover that money laundering, we'd become so notorious around the globe that it was known as the Vancouver model for money laundering. That's how.
That's extraordinary.
Yeah, that our innocent little backwater is always struggling to be world class and manages to get there, and it turns out for money laundering. It really is amazing.
Yeah, but David's done a really good job on this. He's been doing a spectacular job as Attorney General. I gave him, as I did in opposition, I've given him a lot of difficult files in government, but he has exceeded my expectations, and he works very hard every day to try and right the wrongs of previous governments, and also to shine light on some of the areas that were less known, like the challenge of money laundering in our economy. And those are things that we take no glee in that, quite the contrary. But we have to deal with it. And as Bill said, every time we turn over the carpet, there's more dust and more challenges. And that diverts us from our primary goals, which is affordability, making sure that the people have a sense that their government's working for them. That's the objective, but you have to govern. You have to deal with things like LNG. You have to deal with Kinder Morgan. You have to deal with the symbolic issues, and also those that were people were unaware of, like, wow, the magnitude of the problems when it comes to affordability of housing. They're significant, and they require more than just good wishes. You need to work hard and make sure you're including as many people as possible in the solutions.
Andrew McLeod of the Tyee, question about what is probably the most controversial decision you've made so far. Here's Andrew.
Pretty much every day in my Facebook feed or on Twitter or in my email, I get something from someone saying they think that the Site C decision is going to be the downfall of this government, that they won't be re-elected because of it. I'm wondering what you're hearing. Do you see a lasting effect from that decision?
I hear from people every day who still insist that it's not going to get built, in spite of you awarding contracts.
Well, it certainly, Andrew's right. It was an extremely difficult decision for our government to make. It was early in the mandate. It was consistent with my election commitment to have the Utilities Commission review the matter, but not to make the decision. The decision has to fall to government. And we grappled with it, and we did extraordinary things. I was on your show talking about that before the decision was made. We brought in experts and swore them into cabinet for the day so that they could present their evidence, pro and con. And we made a decision, and that's what governments are supposed to do. They don't always make the most popular decision, but they have to make decisions. And we've moved on from that, and I don't want to leave those that are passionate about this with the view that we did not understand and respect the depth of their feeling on this matter. But we have a whole bunch of other things we need to focus on, and we needed to address that issue right at the front. 25% completed, $2 billion spent, another $2 billion potentially to wrap it up. That was too great a barrier to me to achieve all of these other issues that we want to focus on, like childcare, housing affordability, making sure that knee and hip replacements are more readily available to the public, primary care, healthcare facilities in smaller communities. There's a whole bunch of stuff that I wanted to do that we would have been compromised on if we had taken that big a hit in our fiscal plan of a $4 billion write-down on a hydro project. Having said that, the number of letters I've received on this has dropped significantly. And again, not to suggest that the passion around this issue is diminished, but the intensity of the correspondence to me has certainly dropped off. And I don't know if I'm going to get more now because of that, but it was a tough decision. We've made it, and now we're moving on to the next set of issues that we have to deal with.
Troy Sebastian, good question. This is a question, what is probably all the time I've been doing this, writing about BC politics, so more than 30 years. This is probably the biggest unresolved issue, and maybe the biggest unresolved issue in all of British Columbia history. Here's a question from Troy.
John, it's hard to tell where you stand on Indigenous issues. On one day you say you're going to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, where on the other day you're approving the Site C dam. To many Indigenous peoples, it looks like you're standing against us. Why should we trust you?
Thank you, Troy. The challenge of genuine reconciliation and embracing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is that we have a great deal of foundational work that needs to be done. I directed every member of Cabinet to ensure that they understood and implemented those two key elements: reconciliation, the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as well as the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Site C was 25% completed. A decision was made by a previous government to proceed with it. The decision we made was to complete the project based on all of the economic information that we had at our disposal. We consulted widely with Indigenous people before the decision, during the decision, and after the decision. The West Moberly Nation has every right to challenge that in the courts, and they're doing so. The notion that single issues should define how we look at the whole host of unresolved issues is challenging. Salmon farming. I went to the big house, they call it, not the longhouse, the big house in Alert Bay, to talk about the adverse impacts on wild salmon as a result of the location of certain farm sites in the Broughton Archipelago. Indigenous people there passionate about that issue. The province has 10% of the jurisdiction, Vaughn, when it comes to salmon aquaculture. We get 100% of the grief. And it is an obstacle to genuine reconciliation. I agree with Troy in that regard. But if reconciliation is dealing with issues as they emerge. We'll always be dealing with it. We need a framework so that we can proceed together into the future. And that's on the LNG file, for example. A whole host of Indigenous communities want to see that proceed. Others do not. That means we need to work together, those that are opposed, those that are in favor, and those that want to see reconciliation happen. We need to work together for a foundation, not just, okay, that issue's emerged, we'll deal with that issue. If it's a question of issue management, then we'll never get true reconciliation. So why should you believe me now? Because I'm doing my level best to reach out at all times, whenever I can, to make sure that reconciliation is the foundation of our government. And I said, as you heard me today in a press conference, if LNG Canada wants to come to British Columbia, they need to understand that that's a foundational issue for my government and for the people of BC. Trust me now, trust me not, that's up to the public. My commitment has been solid, in my opinion, from the day I involved myself in public life back in the 1980s. And my position has not changed on reconciliation, and I will continue to do my best to win the support of Indigenous communities and non-Indigenous communities.
So on LNG Canada, Michelle Mungal, the Energy Minister, was on the show a couple of weeks ago, and she said there are 21 First Nations along the route that are engaged at some level on the project, and I heard you say today that 16 of them are completely supportive, which means, what, a half dozen are not. On the Petronas project, we saw that even one First Nation leader who was only part of an entire First Nation, who was willing to set up a protest encampment, was able to block that project. So, I mean, I guess the question that would face your government or face LNG Canada is, unless they're all in, how can you go ahead? How do you deal with how many holdouts are there, and how do you deal with the holdouts? And can a holdout veto the whole project?
Well, when it comes to this, let's do an issue management exercise. The LNG project that's currently before us, the decision will be made by the investors. They have their permits, as does, in some instances, the Kinder Morgan project, which is different substance, different location, different issues. But they may well be ready to proceed. So the Haisla Nation in Kitimat is absolutely 100% in favor of LNG Canada. So it's incumbent upon LNG Canada to take that universal support in Kitimat and ensure that it goes throughout the corridor. So that's the company or the investor's responsibility to make sure that they're doing their best to ensure that they're meeting their obligations to not just consultation in the legal sense of it, but genuine participation in the benefits, the upside benefits of this investment. And the question of is it a veto or not a veto, I don't believe it is, because there's no universal or hegemonic position on any issue within Indigenous communities. If Troy was to suggest that the Tanaha, where he comes from in the southeast, has the authority to say that something happening in the northwest with the Lakwalams or the Kitsim-Kalim, I mean, they would laugh him out of town. And similarly, if the Indigenous communities in the northwest came to the southeast, where Troy comes from, and said, we don't want you to do that, they'd be laughed out of town. So there is autonomy within nations, as there always have been within British Columbia prior to colonization or the expansion of Europe. And those issues, as they were dealt with in the past, have to be dealt with in the future. And so there is no quick solution to this, or it would have happened before. My comment to Troy and my comment to you is, my government is absolutely committed to making sure that we have a foundation that will work going forward. But there is no everybody's in or nobody's in. That will not work. It has not worked in the past. We need to find ways to make sure that to the greatest extent possible, the majority of nations are participating in a positive way. That's my objective, and I know that LNG Canada has been directed to that in that regard, and they want to see that happen as well.
Take a brief break on Voice of BC with Premier John Horgan. One more segment to go. Stay with us. We might even get on to proportional representation in the last segment. Who knows? Stay with us.
The NDP has a long-standing policy in favor of proportional representation. They put it as part of their campaign platform that they would have a referendum on proportional representation. They signed a supply and confidence agreement with the Green Party promising to have a referendum on proportional representation and promising to campaign vigorously for it. Yet the Attorney General has been asked to implement that referendum and yet to remain neutral and to have a position of neutrality in that referendum. I don't think that fair-minded people think that that is credible. I don't see how a member of cabinet can be neutral on a public policy issue which the government is foursquare behind.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Smith, president of the BC GEU. Quick, run to the fridge, but get right back because you don't want to miss the rest of Voice of BC.
You know how it goes. Jack and Sarah in a world of their own. Cindy's always texting. Jeff is up for a good time. Oh, and Greg usually does the rolling and the driving. You see, Greg doesn't drink. But did you know that drivers impaired by cannabis or other drugs pose the same dangers and face the same penalties as those impaired by alcohol? License suspension, a criminal record, fines, even jail time. Know the facts. Plan ahead. Visit arrivealive.org to learn more.
I waited 60 years for there to be two NDP governments side by side in BC and Alberta, one led by John Horgan, another by Rachel Notley. And what happens? They're not talking to each other. They're fighting. I can't believe it. 60 years, I'm ready for some peace.
Welcome back to Voice of BC, Premier John Horgan. Premier, I got to ask you about how many questions we could go into on the Kinder Morgan pipeline, but let's try this one. So you had a meeting in Vancouver last week, the Governor of Washington State, Jay Inslee, and he supports you on keeping those nasty tankers out of our mutual waters. And later that day, one of the Liberal MLAs from the Northeast starts tweeting out these pictures, Twitter captures of tankers in our mutual waters headed for one of the 5 refineries in Washington State. So they got 5 refineries. They've had tankers going in and out since 1971, hundreds of them every year. They're trying to buy, from the expanded Kinder Morgan pipeline, their refineries want some of that oil. Isn't there a bit of hypocrisy in the governor of Washington worrying about us adding tankers to the waters when they've been doing it for decades?
Well, in the case of Jay Inslee, he has been a champion of climate action for many, many years as a representative of Congress in Washington, and also now as governor of Washington State. He's wrote a very good book about that. I can't remember the title, but Jay Inslee, you can Google that and see what he has to say. We were together talking about the Pacific Coast Collaborative, which is a collection of governors from California, Oregon, Washington, and the province of British Columbia. And the objective when this was established was to work on climate action and marine safety, ocean health. And so it's not a surprise that when the question came about climate action and ocean health, that Governor Inslee would be supportive of my view that you can't export diluted bitumen through Vancouver without putting at risk, at least to a degree, our marine environment, nor can you realize a serious reduction in climate action, a serious reduction in greenhouse gas emissions when you're multiplying the amount of product that you're sending out of the country. And so I'm not at all surprised that Mr. Inslee would have that point of view. The difference between what they're doing in Washington State and have been for decades and decades, refining oil largely from Alaska, is that it's not diluted bitumen. It's sweet crude from, and now I'll have an expert challenge me on that. They do have diluted bitumen as well. But to cross the border with a pipeline is another extended consultation process. So to go from Abbotsford, for example, if the pipe was to come from Edmonton to Abbotsford and then divert to the refineries in Washington State, that would require a whole new set of hearings. I understand Kinder Morgan's not prepared to do that. But I want to see protections in place to make sure that we're not adversely affecting our marine environment, our local economy, which depends on the pristine environment that we have in British Columbia. And that's been our position during the election, after the election, and up to today, and will be tomorrow. Governor Inslee offered a vote of support to us when he was in Vancouver. I'm grateful for that. But there are people that believe this should happen. There are people that believe it shouldn't happen. And when I talk to Rachel Notley, going back to Bill's question, or when I talk to the Prime Minister, I say, it's not about me, man. It's about the people of British Columbia who feel deeply about this issue. You can quibble with me, you can call me names, as some of the ministers in Alberta have done, but that's not going to change how people feel about this. We have a problem. It's a Canadian problem, and we need to figure a way through it. I haven't seen anything coming from Ottawa or Edmonton that does anything other than put accelerant on an already blazing fire of discontent when it comes to Kinder Morgan. And if we want real leadership on this, it's got to come from Ottawa.
Bother you to see the number of people that are being arrested there, just in terms of it's not nice being arrested and it ain't great for your long-term prospects?
Well, again, this is a federal project. And we're doing our best as a subnational government to raise concerns about the impacts, whether we're in court. We're in 3 separate court filings. One with respect to Burnaby's rights to enforce their bylaws, one with respect to whether the project's in the national interest at all, and most recently hiring Joe Arbe to take the constitutional case about jurisdiction, which has received favorable interest from other provinces who feel strongly about provincial rights. And ironically, Alberta, who's usually at the vanguard of protecting provincial rights, of course, is disinterested. They want us all to lay down and just take the direction from Ottawa. And I don't think British Columbians are prepared to do that.
Yeah, but you're following the law, your government, so far.
I
see a lot of people. I mean, we went through the Clackwatt Wars in the 1990s, and there were, almost 1,000 people arrested. Yeah. I recognize you've got civil disobedience. People are submitting to being arrested, but does it bother you at any level, all these people being arrested?
Of course it does, on a personal level and on a political level as well. But they're expressing their discontent not with me and my government, but with the federal government, and they have every right to do that. But let's go back to Clackwatt, Vaughn, because both of us lived through that. I as a government staffer and you as a reporter. That was a 2-hour ferry ride and a 6-hour drive, some of it over some fairly challenging forestry road terrain. And there were still 1,000 people arrested. Burnaby Mountain is on the SkyTrain route with live streaming access to the internet, which we did not have in 1992-93. So this is going to be a long summer, and I'm not threatening anybody. I don't want people to take away from this that I support any of any civil disobedience that becomes anything more than people submitting to be arrested. But I think that the federal government needs to wake up to the fact that this is in the heart of the major metropolitan center in the province of British Columbia. It's not at the end of a logging road. It's not on the north coast. It's in the heart of Vancouver. And it's going to draw attention internationally, which will be a black mark on British Columbia, and it'll be a black mark on Canada. That's not a threat. That's just a statement of fact. And we need to get our heads around that. Not in a belligerent, I'm not going to drink your wine way. Not in a, we have to push this through way. We need to find a way through. We need an off-ramp, as they say. I'm not sure what that is, but I remain ready and available to talk to whoever wants to come to British Columbia and help us get through this. But it's not my responsibility, and I don't want to say that I'm shrugging or shirking my responsibilities as the leader of the province of British Columbia. I've been making it abundantly clear through legal channels and diplomacy to the extent that I can in a hostile environment that this is a problem and we need to figure it out.
For the fall, British Columbians will be asked to vote by mail on electoral reform. We don't have a lot of detail beyond that. We don't have the question or questions. But still, there's already a preliminary discussion going on about it. And here, with a question about that from the University of Victoria Political Science Department, Jamie Lawson. Here he is.
Premier Horgan, I've got a question about electoral reform. And it goes like this. You haven't had enough time, really, to do something complicated in terms of consultation like the Citizens' Assembly. And you haven't spelled out for the province what your preferred option is in terms of electoral reform. Is it really possible to get this thing done in this session in a way that'll survive your own government? Or is there something I'm missing here?
And he's a supporter.
Yeah, well, not of me, of the
no, of the
representation.
yeah.
Well, he makes very good points, and I remember back to when I left government, I was working in the private sector. The Campbell government put in place a citizens' assembly. Great idea. I supported it. I applauded it at the time. They came forward with what I believe was an unworkable mechanism in a province as large as British Columbia, with sparsely populated rural areas. The two constituencies of Peace River North and Peace River South have fewer people than are in a major constituency in downtown Vancouver. So the representation by population does not happen in British Columbia right now. Our first past the post system is distorted because of the vast geographic areas. So when we come up with a proportional representation tool or a mechanism, we need to make sure that rural communities don't feel that they're losing representation, but in fact that they will still have their voices and their opinions heard in legislatures, and that their community will have someone that they can go to. That's the foundation of our representative democracy, is someone is accountable to their neighbors, not just a list of party members who get to be elected because you got this many votes. And so he's right, the professor's quite right. We're trying to develop a series of questions, whatever the Attorney General comes back with after the consultation, and we're going to put that to the public and let them decide. But I am absolutely clear on the challenges that we have, the limited time period. I want to make as much impact as I possibly can in the time I have available as the 36th Premier of British Columbia. I campaigned on this. I have a colleague and an ally in the Green Caucus to drive this, to let the public decide. And that's what we intend to do.
And you've said you're planning to campaign for this, right?
That's right.
It's not just that you're going to put the ballot out there.
That's right.
Do you know what you're going to be campaigning for yet?
Not yet, because that consultation process is in the arm's length hands of the Attorney General. And just for the record, every time this comes up, David leaves the room, whether it be in Cabinet or in caucus, so that he can be unfettered by the opinions he hears from colleagues. He wants to hear directly from the public, and he will be constructing how we go forward with input from the people, not from political
colleagues. But he
colleagues.
Supports himself proportional representation.
Oh, absolutely. We're unapologetic about that.
How can he be neutral on the questions and so forth?
Because the neutrality comes not in the opinions of for or against. The neutrality is the question fair? Is it understandable? And are we giving people adequate information so they can make a decision? Now, David has a point of view. We all have points of view. But to the extent possible, he's removing himself from the political discussion around this so that he can focus on making sure that there's a fair process and a fair question that's understandable, and that there's not a disproportionate amount of, I'm going to be campaigning for it, but I'm not going to bring a huge ad campaign, as Rob Shaw would ask me, with government money. We're going to have a yes campaign and a no campaign, as we did in the two previous referenda on this question, and we're going to try and make it as fair as we possibly can, and a question that's as understandable as it can be to the public. But the foundation for me is, I've said this on this program at least 2 or 3 times in the 16 visits. I voted against it in 2005 because I understood first past the post, and I voted in favor of it in 2009 because I had endured 4 years in opposition with no influence over policy that affects my constituents. And the people that I represent deserve to have their voices heard regardless of how they vote. And that's one of the advantages of proportional representation.
Yes, everyone has an opinion on it, and here's someone who certainly does, Bill Tillman.
Premier Horgan, before the election you made it very clear on the referendum on electoral systems that there would be 2 clear choices, first past the post and another choice, which would be presumably a proportional representation system yet to be defined. But the government consultation and Attorney General David Eby have suggested multiple choice, multiple part questions on this referendum. Do you still think that the position you originally took, 2 clear choices, first past the post versus proportional representation, is the right one? And will that be what we see on the ballot?
Well, full disclosure, Bill is the head of the No campaign.
He certainly is.
And he's also a friend, and I know that he's going to work as hard as he can.
His record, as he will quickly tell you, is 4 referendum campaigns, all wins.
Yes. He's not as successful on election campaigns, but he's very good at these focused, issue-specific campaigns. And I don't want to divulge, I don't know, quite honestly, what the Attorney General will come back with. We've talked about this on this program in interviews and just walking down the halls of the legislature. I want to make it as simple as possible so people understand that there is what we have and there's what we could have. And what we could have is a whole subset of options. And that's, I think, Bill's point, is that is the public going to have a clear understanding of where we're going to go? Or is it just going to be not this one, not first past the post, yes to proportional representation, and then what comes from that? I think that might well be the safest course of action. Here are your two options, and then under this one, there's a whole host of sub-options. That makes it more complicated, and again, I'll leave it up to David Eby to figure out how we put this question to the public. But most importantly, we are going to ask people what they think, and it's incumbent upon voters to participate. And some have argued, the Liberals argued, for example, well, this is unfair because the majority will make the decision. Well, that's kind of what democracy is all about. And it's incumbent upon those who are opposed, like Bill and some of the BC Liberal members, to make their constituents aware that they have options here. And they can campaign against all they want. I have no problem with that. But to suggest that people won't have choices is just not true. We're going to give people that option. That's the whole point of asking them what they think. And that's why during the creation of the government, you and I talked about would I forego the option of asking people and just impose. And I was not prepared to do that because the public needs to make choices about how they elect the people that represent them. Pretty fundamental issue. The Green Caucus agrees, and we have a plan to put the question to the public in October or November, sometime in the fall, and we'll live with the result of that.
And if it passes, it gets implemented in 2021.
That's right.
Because it takes a while to change the system.
Yeah. And that falls to the, as you know, Chief Electoral Officer, who's in BC, one of the busiest Chief Electoral Officers in the country.
Yes,
and now with electoral finance reform, also a huge transformation in how we do business. Going back to Rob Shaw's first question, what have you done to make life different in politics? Taking big money out of politics is huge, and it's going to have a significant impact, not just on the next election, but subsequent elections as well.
Next year, some 180 contracts for some 300,000 people working in the public sector, and that's everybody. Crown Corporation employees, nurses, doctors, teachers, everybody, expire. The Liberals arranged it that way. Most of them expire March 31st. Some of them in the school system, it's the end of June. Many of those people are coming off 3 or 4 rounds of wage restraint under the BC Liberals, and they've got a new government. They are looking, many of them, for catch-up. No surprise. They've already hinted at some of the things they're looking for. I'm going to ask you, Premier, I keep hearing it's one of the big challenges the government faces next year. What's going to be your approach?
Well, we are developing a negotiating mandate through public sector bargaining entities. That's in the hands of Carol James, the Minister of Finance. She has the 3-year fiscal plan, and within that fiscal plan, we had anticipated entering into bargaining in the coming year to see potential increases in wages and benefits in 2019, 2020, and beyond. So we're planning for that. We're preparing for that. But I'm a firm believer in collective bargaining. My allies in the labor movement understand that, but they also understand that we have to bargain within the envelope that we have available. And we are fortunate enough to live in British Columbia at a time when the economy is very robust. This is a result not of government policy directly, it's a result of the ingenuity and hard work of the people of British Columbia. And that hard work has manifested itself in surplus budgets, manifests itself in our capital budget for the next 3 years is $15 billion for roads and bridges and transit and a whole host of schools and hospitals. So we have money in the kitty and the space to build a stronger British Columbia. But once you build those schools and hospitals, you need to have people in them. You need the healthcare professionals, you need teachers, you need care aides, teachers' aides, you need CUPE members to be there to make sure the schools are open and ready to go. And I think the public understands that. We're going to bargain hard, but we're going to bargain fair.
And you're not going to bargain in public.
And I'm not going to bargain on this show. Yeah, that's right.
Premier, thanks very much. I really appreciate you being on the show. Appearance number 16, who knows? Maybe appearance number 17 one of these days. Thank you for watching Voice of BC, bringing the legislature, BC politics into your living room. Good night. It was good?
The following is a community access program. While this program does not necessarily reflect the views of Shaw or its employees, Shaw is proud to support local producers and share local voices, ideas, and opinions. To find out more about community access television, training, and volunteer opportunities, please visit